Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ananke Women in Literature Festival, the fourth edition. I'm delighted to host the panel today on poetry in process. It's called All Roads Lead to Poetry.
Hiba?
Yeah,
Should we
I don't know. We lost her.
should we stay in here and log back in or wait? Oh, she's coming.
Oh,
Okay.
she's there.
Yes, gosh, technically glitches. All right, I'll introduce my panelists briefly. Sascha Akhtar. Sascha has crafted 7 metaphysical poetry collections, a short story collection of necessity and wanting, embracing social realism, and a volume comprising a biography and first-time translations from Urdu of Hijab Imtiaz's little-known manuscript called Adab-e-Zari with Oxford University Press. Akhtar is a lecturer at the University of Greenwich and poetry school tutor. She performs both locally and internationally. Some highlights include the Medway Festival of Literature 2023, Emirates Festival of Literature 2022, and Poetry International Rotterdam 2012. Shikha Malaviya is a poet, writer, and publisher. Her book of historical persona poetry, Anandi by Joshi, A Life in Poems, is a unique retelling of the life of India's first female medical doctor and the first Indian woman to study medicine in the United States. Shikha's previous book of poems, Geography of Tongues, was published to acclaim in 2014. Her poetry has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and featured in Catamaran Plume and other fine publications. Shikha has been a featured TEDx speaker and was selected as Poet Laureate of San Ramon, California 2016. Shikha is co-founder of the Great Indian Poetry Collective, a mentorship model literary press, and is currently a Mosaic America Fellow. She lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with a family where she is a poetry mentor, publisher, and curator. Heba Heba. Heba, a Pushcart nominated poet from Pakistan, currently works as an English instructor at FAST NUCES Islamabad. Her poems have been published in Unoya Review, Fragmented Voices, Aleph Review, and Poetry Wales, among others. In 2021, Heba was the first runner-up for the New Feathers Award. Her debut poetry collection, Birth of a Mural, Golden Dragonfly Press 2023, was featured in the News on Sunday as one of the best-loved books of 2023. She fondly misses her cat, Daisy, who holds a special place in her heart. Welcome to the panel, all of you. I'll begin with Sascha. And Sascha, as we were chatting just before the panel, I'm particularly interested in that special angle that you have for your work. So I know that for the poetry school, you have developed a pedagogy and teaching materials where you've used a spectrum of magical praxis and its relationship to poetry. I'm particularly interested in zooming in on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me at this wonderful event. Um, the thing is, so this has been sort of a lifelong fascination um, with this idea that, you see, if you study, so the manuscripts of magic, medieval magic, and not just Arabic as well, Persian as well, but also Greek, Latin. Um, there has, and also, of course, the holy books that are of every religion. Um, there is a sense of poetry, right? This is
Bilkul.
at the heart of all sort of um, texts that are meant to have a kind of a power over humans. Um, and I'm very interested in indigenous practice, which I put I liken, or not liken, but for me it's ancient knowledge and indigenous knowledge, are coalesce. So this has been now, something that I've been looking at and studying as an independent scholar, for over 20 years. Um, and I decided to take this and wanted to share it with people, because it has informed my poetry, but not in some conscious way. So that's the it's not that I'm trying to create spells or
Yeah,
magic.
yeah.
Never consciously doing that, but I have always been very um my ear. I have a very keen ear. So my poetry is a lot about the ear and music. So how do these books and practices, how do they use language to create this sense of poetry? So I took that sort of research and I put it forward to the poetry school and I said, this is what I want to do. I just,
Hmm.
and it took a few years actually.
To
The
convince them?
Well, it was back and forth, and then it was a whole thing. It was, I don't know why it took a few years. I think there was a changeover, and but it happened, and now I'm quite proud of the fact that I've been doing this since 2018 regularly. I do these courses. So my last course, for example, was so my interest is at the moment in Nordic magic, so Icelandic. And also I've been studying, the sort of connections between the Arabs and the Vikings,
Hmm.
because there was Ali was found inside the clothing of Vikings, like stitched inside, just the words Ali. And so there has been a coalescing of cultures, and poetry has always been very important for the Arabs as well, you know apart from the Quran as well, poetry. So it's this idea of calling on this as our poetic heritage. So it's also, to be honest, a lot, the huge part of everything, no, the only part of everything I do is a decolonization practice in
Yes.
in life. So I am interested in living a life of decolonization practice. And that
I
is, yeah.
I love that idea because, when poets or writers are asked who was your literary influence or what was the influence, it's either the influences that they cite or that they are consciously aware of are either nationalistic or regional. And those terms are so false. Those divisions are so false. And I love this idea of that being our collective heritage, not just for poetry, but for um, inspiration in general. So Sascha, you spoke about this magical chant like quality that all good poetry has, and we experience that both as a listener of poetry and as poets, because when we are writing, you'll know what I'm talking about, we are not consciously thinking through the poem is writing itself, and you're just allowing for that to happen. Maybe several years later for a panel or something, you're actually thinking about it, okay, this is what happened, and the pieces seem to make sense, but never consciously am I thinking my way through a poem. Similarly, when you're reading a poem, I remember T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. I used to read it. I was haunted by it for years before it started to make sense. And T.S. Eliot, he says himself that poetry is like music. It doesn't have to make sense, and it exercises that power over you. So, with what you just described, your project with Poetry School, you went beyond that spell or that power to deconstruct it or to see, if I may say, the mathematics of it, and then teach those to your students.
Yeah, yeah. So basically, if you look at so in Nordic, so if you there's the Poetic Edda, which is the Icelandic, one of the first, but also humanities, one of the first books of poetry, epic poetry, right? And that, if you study all of this, there are not just one or two or three kinds of meters, but there is a Galdasrag, which is chant meter. and there is an actual meter, and there are then variations of these meters, and they are based in, it's called seder, which is seidr, but in Icelandic, and I don't speak Icelandic. I, you know, my, when I get led to these things, I get led intuitively. We have a lot of
Mm,
uh, 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 spirituality in my family, and we like to learn from everything. Um, so there are these chant meters, and I got obsessed with this idea of a meter just for chants that has a precedent in magical practice, which is what Sidra is. That that you can create this power to impress. So let's go to what is magic. Okay, so for me, this is a huge subject, but it's very simple, because we live in this world of sort of the what I call the reality construct. For me, it's a construct. Everything is laid out. Magic means simply transformation. So if you just boil it down, it's transformation.
mm,
So if you
mm,
are performing an act of magic, not in the entertainment magic way, but
mm,
even that is transformation. You're transforming a hat from an
mm,
hat to a
mm,
rabbit, but that's a
mm,
different thing. This is more about psychic, emotional, psycho-spiritual transformation,
mm.
which is the basis of alchemia, which is alchemy, um,
Yeah,
which actually all of Western magic owes a huge debt to, is the early Arab and Irani texts. And anyway, so if we look at that transformation, and poetry has the it's at the top. It's at the top. So shamans,
true.
ritualists, um, all kinds of ceremonies in indigenous practice, poetry is at the top. Cause why? Why? So then if you look at so in Icelandic magic, there's this wonderful ideas of how even the word has a kind of power. Every word, every letter has power. So, and this also has precedence in Hurufiyya, in Islamic esoteric practice, and in Sanskrit, in the Vedic. It has precedence. So my interest is a syncretic worldview. So if you start thinking like that of our heritage, as humans, poetic heritage, then you realize that it's unlimited. It's limitless what you can do with your
Exactly.
poetry. You see?
Sasha, I was hearing you talk, and at the back of my mind, I was thinking that everything you said, about each word has power. Our mothers used to, growing up, say,
Mm,
choose your words carefully, don't say anything negative about yourself. So, because words have transformative power.
yeah.
वो कहते नहीं है that run of the mill quote, whether you think you can or you can't, it's true. I mean,
Mm.
if you keep telling yourself, and
Oh yes.
that is transformation. Similarly, when you're performing poetry or when you're in a poetry recitation, we use that term, the audience was spellbound.
Yeah.
So that is true. They are spellbound because there is, I mean, whether consciously or conscious, there is a spell. And
Yes.
after a good uh, reading of literature or after a good experience of a poetry evening, you are changed in some way. You will not go about your daily business with your eyes closed. There's some part of you which is awakened. So essentially, yes, it makes so much sense.
Yeah. And
So,
sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go ahead.
Well, just also then relating that to the decolonization part is that if you look, so looking at this idea, it has precedence in every cultural practice and indigenous practice in the world, right? So the
Mm,
only place it doesn't have that is in the academicized English. Poetry is the domain of English, is the domain of a paradigm that dominates poetry in English
mm,
for which now for me has no acceptable place. I basically I reject it. If I go into an academy setting and I see a module or a program and I see the same, dead white men from
Oh
the
yeah.
90, I reject it. This is not poetry to me. You are narrow. It is a narrow worldview. So,
Hmm.
but then going to our own tradition of the subcontinent, this has precedence in that. I used to go to poetry, evenings, mehfils with my nana, and it is all about hal, right? Hal.
Exactly.
Hal jo aap
Exactly.
pehle aap ye you were referring to this hal mein aana, taking the audience into the hall, Ghazal's
Hmm.
relationship to music, all of it is about, this transformative atmosphere, which what my thesis is that this is magic. There is no difference.
Absolutely. And also, Sasha, if you think about the traditions of experiencing poetry in our part of the world, the mushaira, the
Mushaira.
audience is so, they are so obviously and so pleasurably enchanted, and they're so participating in, those shouts of pleasure. That's a part of the reading, and it's a part of the experience. Jabke here, the poetry readings are rather, I mean, it's considered impolite for the audience to speak too much or
But
whatever.
that's
They're
a
listening in
colonizer.
silence. Yes,
That's the
yes,
colonizer. The colonizer,
exactly.
it
And I was,
eradicates us. It eradicates
yes, yes,
everything.
exactly,
Eradicates magic. It eradicates magic. So
among other things. Yes. Wonderful. This was so insightful. Sasha, do you have a poem that you could read for us?
oh, okay. Yeah, sure, I can read the poem. Um, how long? Just a few minutes, maybe
Let's say 4 minutes, 4 to 5.
4 minutes. Okay. So because we've been speaking about these ideas, I will read you a poem that sort of sometimes I overtly talk about magical tropes within my work. So, for example, like chaos magic, which is it's a Western trope, but the ideas are basically, to me, it's how we create poetry, where we create an order out of chaos. Um, so this poem is called Chaos Totem. So the idea of a totem also, it's like
Hmm.
a construction that has a meaning and intention for a specified sort of result of some kind. So this is a poem as a totem, and it's called Chaos Totem.
Sure.
If it is condors in the night sky, a gilded wooing eruption in the empress way of stars, I hear each bar of the xylophone beaten by their wings, battling the atmosphere. A wish to pass behind the firewall, you. If it is fire starters in the dim, in the cavernous, in the ruins of the day, a pacing, piercing undulation rippling under the skin, I feel each dig of the claws of the panther puncturing my lungs to a paler, slivered shadow of breath. Your smile glowing in the tint of a nuclear sun, the dream of red letters every night new. If it is angels of mercy unfurling ragged wings on runny skies, I see Sophia's paintings dripping on my head, and each prayer wheel spins in the temples of Kathmandu. Furiously, yellow bellied pigeons fall over from lack of oxygen. Eggs are fried on the bonnets of cars, and I hear the noctiluca roaring of its hunger. If it is, I draw the line, I choke the hold on time, and supply runs short. Shoals of unborns playing tantras with wooden legs on tankers, carrying oil explode, and melt the very tar soul of the road, and you must run for your very, very life.
Beautiful. Sasha, I know that you have to leave early. So I'd like to ask you to share a prompt with our listeners, a
Sure.
poetry prompt, which is in tune with what you just described.
Well, one of the things that I always return to, and with my students as well, is the complete oracular poetry prompt, which is well, there's many ways to do it, but for this session, what I'll say is uh, pick up a book that has meaning to you. It can be any book, it can be anything, any publication, any print, anything. And a book will be better because you'll have more choice. And then randomly, you can even just do it the way we do with the, divination, where you just open the book and see what's there. So pick a bunch of words. So this is a two-step poetry prompt. You can choose to write the poem at any time. So you pick the words. Let's put a limit on it. Let's say like 8 to 12 maybe. But you can do whatever you want. You can keep
Hmm.
going. And then you write those words on little pieces of paper and you put them in a hat and you pick out that way. It can even be a set of words, it can be an expression, and you just totally randomize the event. And you see what you were saying about how you don't even always, it's not an intellectual process, the writing
Not
of
at all.
poetry. So that's what I'm often always actually getting to with my students as well, is that don't try it. And actually, I think some of the worst poetry in this world is
Oh,
the
yeah,
overly intellectualized, uh, academicized poetry that is not coming from a place of Hal or a duende. Look at Lorca. Look at Lorca.
totally.
Lorca was, so yeah, so completely randomize the event. Or I send students sometimes into the forest, you know, and they pick objects and
Hmm.
they do poems like that. So it's all a decolonization act. It's sort of liberating ourselves from the shackles of colonial poetic constructs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And trusting our own instincts with the process
Instinct.
and our own knowledge, our own wisdom,
Yeah.
instead of always looking to a textbook written by a dead white person.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So, with the question, I would like to segue to Hiba and Shikha. I will ask you this question, Sasa. How important is form to your process? Is that a frontal concern, or and does your relationship with form change from collection to collection?
You asking me?
I'm asking you, then I will move to Hiba and
Oh,
Shikha.
I'm obsessed with form.
Mm-hmm.
uh so I have a preoccupation with form, um which has manifested in many different ways because my background is I consider myself an artist. And I reiterate that quite often. It's less about being a writer, poet, it's an artist because I began my career as a visual artist. So to be obsessed with forms is a very it's an artistic sort of preoccupation. And what happens is with every book, the form has established itself. So this is also, you study the forms and
Hmm.
then you throw away the forms. And then I really advocate for creating your own forms, which can happen if you set yourself, a few things, like you have a few constraints in place, and then you can create your own forms. But then
Hmm.
on a meta level, the form itself of the object. So that's why I just really wanted to free the poetry from the shackles of the book.
Hmm.
So I
Yeah.
am now moving towards, in my sort of poetic, create artistic career, towards full liberation from books, although there will be books with there are,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I created a I pitched again. I just pitched ideas to people, and that's
Mm,
how I've ever done anything. So I pitched it to the publisher. I said I want to make these poems as a deck, as cards. Now, I wasn't using that, I wasn't saying I want to make a tarot set, because I would never dream of, imposing on an ancient practice and saying I'm making a tarot set. That's just not me. But I wanted, the form was of interest to me, that
mm,
way there's no order, there's no linearity. And then with my latest book, I've just gone completely renegade, because it's all hand drawn, visual
mm.
emblems and charts, that I'm again drawing on magical praxis, because of our magical squares, which people don't know, that a lot of African Muslim slaves used these magic squares as acts of resistance. They would create these, which we know, I think, as taweez as well, but
Mm.
there's this whole mo- act so this whole layer of resistance, and that's what I am, basically interested in. So yeah, I think as a poet, I think we should constantly challenge ourselves with forms. Um, like I was telling you earlier about these Icelandic magical uh,
Yeah.
meters. They're really exciting, and then also creating your own version of it. So not like blindly, like how many freaking sonnets are we, it's, can we just, can we just not, please?
I like how you call out the extreme constraint of poetry only being available in the form of a book. I
Yeah,
mean, poetry belongs everywhere. When I'm in the metro and I read poetry on the metro, it changes the color of your journey. Poetry belongs everywhere where
yeah.
humans are. It belongs in the forest. So yeah, thank you. And I'd like to take that question to Hiba and Shikha as well. How important was form to your process? So Hiba, I'm talking to you about the first collection, your debut,
Yeah.
The Birth of a
Yeah.
Mural. How important was form
So,
for that collection?
because you read the book as well, you'd know that I didn't really go for any fixed form. I went for
Yeah.
just free verse, because my focus was more on um, just this sort of like mysterious relationship with where I would, sort of like close or end my verses, and where I would start the other one. So that, but also I focused also on musicality and then the content, and because it's something new, I'm still experimenting. And because Sasha said that, you can also invent your own forms and you do not have to stick with the traditional forms. So in terms of the traditional forms, I really haven't, I mean, as a teenager, I'd write sonnets, and then my
We
language
all
was
did.
also that middle English sort of language in which you practiced sonnets. But I actually, because I studied English literature and linguistics in Pakistan, and you know how much all the English literature and linguistics is about the British English poetry. Now we've started studying American, African American, South Asian, but primarily it was all about um, this British English and all the forms that we. So those weren't really that appealing for me. But recently, in my more recent works, I started experimenting with Zio-Hitsu style of poetry, which is
Mm.
like which is a Japanese
Okay.
form. It's sort of like epistolary in nature, and I like that. I also like ghazals, but ghazals, again, they're so westernized now. That ghazal
Oh
form,
yeah.
but I'm bringing back the original Urdu form, the Kafiya and Radif, of that and all of that. So I'm experimenting with that. But yes, in my debut poetry collection, I did not really stick with form, because I think For me, most people say that it's something like, that it sort of like arranges all your thoughts and your ideas in a certain frame. But for me, it was more of a confining, restricting thing. In, for my first collection, I'd say.
Yeah, and that
No,
might
except
change for
when
future
you
collections.
created your own form. Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt.
No, no.
I just want to say, because Hiba's book is excellent and there's so many
Yes.
levels to it, and what you've done is that the content has dictated the form. So there
Yes.
is a form, it's just not a traditional form, right?
Yeah.
It's like a
Yeah,
remix.
yeah, yeah.
Like it's like a dub form, like a remix form. Yeah.
What was your experience with form, Shikha, for Anandi by Joshi?
So very interesting, actually, and probably the opposite of Hiba in that sense. But like, I just want to first say that I was very anti-form when I was studying poetry. I did my bachelor's and master's in creative writing, and I was all into free verse, and I loved the prose poem. It still is one of my favorites that I fall back to. But in the case of Anandi Bai Joshi, because she is a historical figure from the 19th century, at that time, poetry wasn't form, and the voice in general was a much more formal voice, which was quite dramatic. So I had to actually wrestle with form, and surprise, surprise, I enjoyed it. And the thing was, though, I did not stick to one type of form. I did different forms, and yes, there are some sonnets, but what I like to term the modern sonnet is in here. But I did epistolary poetry. I did write a ghazal, in fact, the modern ghazal, not the traditional type of ghazal, but I did do that, in fact. And then I had what is known as visual poetry. I had ekphrastic poetry. So I did all sorts of different forms because I was telling a life story, a very brief life of 21 years. But because life has its ups and downs, the form had to change according to different situations in her life. So, and then I have poems which are couplets, and someone, a poet friend of mine, a very wonderful established poet friend of mine, is like, "You're using couplets, but why are you using it in this way?" And I said, "Well, that's how it came out, So, it was organic, but at the same time, these forms, like, for example, when Anandi Bai Joshi has to dissect the body of a dead baby, and it's very difficult, and everybody else, all the other medical students, ran out of the room except her, and she decided to become a doctor because she had lost her own child. So I can only imagine the resolve and strength she must have had. But I used the pantoum form so that this thing that might have been so horrific for her was also in the form of a lullaby, so that this horrific act has some padding around it, So, it was very interesting to see how the form sort of chose the poem and vice versa, It was a very intuitive process. So it wasn't like I was trapped at all. So yeah, so that was my experience with form in this book.
Yeah, I think the key here is to be in control of form and to allow ourselves permission to do whatever we want with form, not to take form as a dictate from somebody, who's unfamiliar with our experience or whatever. All right, great. Hiba, for your debut, it was a very personal collection, and if I may say, coming of age of sorts. And I'm interested in the interiority of that process and what that journey so deep within yourself was like.
So these poems that I wrote, they're actually, some of them I wrote in my late teens, and then I went back to them, I edited them, and then I decided that they should stay. And then most of them are in my early 20s. So it's not like I sat down and I wrote 40 poems at a time. It's never like that, or I wrote them in a span of a year. It's like many years. So that's why you can see the whole that theme, come age theme, because it started from my mid-teens all the way to my early 20s. And something you must have seen that the poem has so many themes, and most of them deal with grief and motherhood and loss. And that's because for me, this was my, probably you could say, the first time where I was trying to uh, process my mother's death. She died when I was 14, but like I was trying to process it through poetry, written word. And I think that's why I'd say that most of the experiences that I write about are usually my mom as the speaker, because, in the beginning of grief, when you are missing someone, so that person is almost like God to you. You forget who they were in real, whatever their positive or negative sides were, you just glorify them. That's like the initial part of grief, at least for me. So you'd see so many things, in which I've created mother as this very godly persona in my poems. So this was one part that I had to deal with and I had to process. And then there were so many other things, like, for instance, for me, um, because I recently found out that I have a certain condition, and because of that, I was always, this a very hardcore daydreamer in my school life, and even now. And then I was hypersensitive and still am. So you'd see that my interaction with my senses and my senses interaction with the ordinary things around them. So this is what I've tried to do. I really like that Sasha said that she'd send her students to the forest to explore. And this is something, because I've lived here in this home since my birth, and you know how South Asian families work. We stay with our parents mostly. We don't really move out unless we get married or we want to pursue um, something mastered or whatever. So like for me, staying here and looking at the same things every day, the dead objects, you do tend to get tired of them. But because of your imagination and the way you tend to physicalize your emotions through those objects, that's what I've, primarily dealt with in my poems. You'd see that in my poem, The Vicissitudes of Self, I wrote it during the COVID period, and we were all quarantined inside. All there was coffee cups around us, or desks, curtains, all these home objects around us. And I tried to that pathetic fallacy thing where you try to tell whatever is inside you, and you try to sort of like express it through the world around you, inner worlds versus outer worlds. So most of my poetry is about that, and I do think that most of it, after writing it, it was a very transformative journey, because first of all, if you know that as Pakistani people, most of us, especially people from my generation, we're called the Zillennials, and we grew up reading all those mystery books because that's what our parents told us to read, Nancy Drew and whatnot. And I never really read poetry growing up. I loved music, all sorts of music, but poetry, I never really read it as much, but when I started writing, it came out as poetry. And I always wanted to be a mystery crime novelist as a child. Yeah. But one of my friends, Daniel, he's also a writer and editor, and he said that when I read your poem, there's always an element of mystery to your poems. Like whatever you're writing, it says it tends to say more than just one thing. And I think it's nice because even when I go through it, I always tend to find something about myself there. And it's then a very nice sort of self-discovery, um, uh, sort of like I tend to embark on that sort of journey. So yeah.
Heba, I was listening to a conversation you were having on a podcast called Raw and Real, and I was wondering, what was it like writing that book as a Pakistani, knowing that you're in a context where so many other women share your experience, but very few have the privilege to write, to put pen to paper and to express it. And so in a way, they are looking up to you, looking to you for answers. Does that create pressure or some sort of, I don't know, responsibility?
I think it's both, because pressure, I think pressure is always here. When you live in this kind of society, you are surrounded by all these pressure to, if you are, because you're representing something, so there is that pressure there. But in terms of responsibility, I do feel like it's very important for me to sort of voice all those injustices happening around me, especially for women and women who cannot speak up. And if they do, they can get in bad trouble. So I'll share my own experience, because I also come from that part of the society, sort of like middle class, where certain ideas are considered very, they're stigmatized, and to call them a stigma is a very sort of like decent thing to say. They're just, they're violent actions that that you can come across if you utter certain things. But I still did. But I think, because coming from a society, from a place where English is not your native language, and people often question you, why did you use English to write poetry? Because I'm living here and I studied Urdu equally, and I even write Urdu poetry. I love writing Urdu poetry, and I'm working on it too. My father's side is Punjabi, so I'm always, I like listening to Punjabi poetry too. So when people ask me, why did you choose English? So I think I actually sort of like used this language for the very reason, for the very labels it holds in our society, like, a language that sort of separates you from certain classes so that they cannot understand. And I chose this language to talk about everything that is, that I feel as a woman growing up here, and my experiences, and the patriarchal sort of like experiences that we've all dealt with. So for me, it was that, and I think I found a safe place in the English language itself. So for instance, if anyone who would read my poems, most of my poems, it's almost like you're reading Urdu poems in Urdu, but the language is English, the diction is English. Yeah. So
I agree with that. Yeah.
So I think I found a safe place in that sense. And for me, I think the reason why I chose English is so that I can, represent all those voices and be responsible for sort of like doing justice to all these unheard voices.
Heba, could you read us a poem?
All right, sure. So I'm going to read a very short poem, and it has many allusions, but it sort of talks about the same things that I talked about. Because as bilingual poets, we have many identities. I mean, I'm trilingual in a sense, because I also know Punjabi, I know Urdu, I know English. So living in this society, post-colonial Pakistan, we have different relationship with languages. And then there's also Arabic, which is the language of our religion. So English and Arabic sort of like hold that very superior sort of place in our culture. And Urdu is then considered a very normal, or in poetic terms, it's also a very supreme language. So I'll talk about those things and how we use languages as accessories, or how we shift from one persona to another. It's called verbis diablo, which is in Latin means devil's words. So Mammon now lurks in English dactyls, stressed syllables untethering the bonds of stout Punjabi ragas. The accentuated ers and oh my gods, and the most misconstrued like like the invisible cries of Habba Khatun, lost in translation, lost in the history of voice, when voice was not a political strum. She is a poet because she wiped her tears with the cadence of language. At Maghrib, the Muazzin gargles with Arabic verses. The English teacher at school, slick as a Baruch Lando, drunk with the scent of Marilyn Monroe, siphons Urdu from our dreams. True splendor is in performing wuzu, with impurities usurping the throats. So,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks. Hiba, could you share a poetry prompt
All
with our
right.
listeners?
So there are at least, so the one prompt is where, there's this psychological technique, grounding technique, where you count sort of like, to calm yourself when you're going through an anxiety episode. You count 5 things you can see, 4 things you can maybe touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can, what's the other sense? Yeah, smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So usually, so some of my poems are, because they do have that sort of therapeutic healing sort of theme going on in them, because I do tend to interact again with my senses, and let my senses interact with all these things. And then I write, like, okay, I'll include 3 things that I can see in the poem, and 2 things that I can hear. So one is that, but there's another one which is similar to Sasha's. She said that, you open a random page of a book and you see the word. For me, because I grew up listening to all these, music genres, metal rock, hip hop, and even Urdu songs, strings, all of that. So for me, mostly what I do is that I listen to music to get in the mood. And usually I pick up words from the songs, whether they're Urdu words. If I'm writing in English, I translate them to English, or I'll start thinking that, oh, what is a good translation for these particular words, and then I sort of like string them in a poem, or any English word that I would really, that would sit with me, and I'll add it in my poem. So for me, it's like, you can listen to music and you can pick up words and you can string them together. If you can't start,
Okay.
yeah, you don't know where
Wonderful.
to start.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks. Shikha, to come down to your work on Anandi Bai Joshi, it was such a masterpiece in voice, because you read those persona poems and you could hear the person speaking through those poems. And I'm curious as to what your process was for first finding what her voice was, and then what internal switch did you flip on to sound like her? And how long did the process take?
So, okay, to answer these questions, so I'll go back to 2017, where I first discovered who Anandi Bai Joshi was, because I'd partially grown up here, partially in India. And to answer that question, like, where do we come from? And as people who live in the diaspora, our roots, aren't that strong, because often it's just that, our parents moved here and that's why, we came here. So I wanted to know who the first Indian woman was who came to the United States. And so I did a search on the internet, and lo and behold, I saw this beautiful photograph, a black and white photograph of Anandi Bai, and she was kind of seated like this, and in a sari, and next to her was a Japanese woman in a kimono, and then next to her was a Syrian woman who was wearing a beautiful headdress, and had a lyre next to her, that harp, small harp type of thing. And so this photograph was so arresting that it sort of pulled me in. And then I started researching more on Anandi Bai Joshi, and I was so shocked that outside of Maharashtra, people really didn't know who she was. And she was India's first female medical doctor. And her life even though I guess you could say she was born into privilege because she was born into a high caste family, right? And casteism was very strong at that time, but still she went through so many struggles in order to come to the United States and study to become a doctor. So I kept on doing research, and I found bits and pieces. I found a biography written by a woman named Caroline Dahl, and that had excerpts from Anandibai's letters, which was like it was like finding treasure because I got to actually see her voice. But unfortunately, in all the narratives that had been written about her, it was always through the lens of her husband. It was a very patriarchal lens that we got to see Anandibai, that it was because of her husband that she became a doctor and things like that. So then when I started doing my research on and off, because I would think, oh no, I can't do this. How can I do this? What form should I do this in? Should it be poetry? Should it be fiction? Well, then, I, I realized that I had to bring out her voice. I had to somehow return her agency back to her, right? And so that's why I decided to do historical persona poetry and to write in her so-called imagined voice. And yes, the task was very daunting because I thought, how can I accurately portray a 19th century Indian woman's voice and not bring my own voice into it? So actually, it's a leap of faith. And you have to sort of trust yourself. And I actually would look up to the sky and say, okay, listen, Anandibai, if your spirit is there, please give me your blessings and tell me whatever you want to tell me. I'm like a conduit. And in that sense, it was a mystical experience for me. I did take her permission. And then I just tried to put myself in her shoes. And because I started the actual writing of this book during the pandemic, the rest of the world had shut down. So in a way, that was probably the best time for me to slip into her life, her world. And so I was able to immerse myself because our world had stilled all around us. So it wasn't easy, but once I trusted the process and trusted myself and had done enough research to, feel that I knew her life, then it wasn't that difficult to get into her voice. Yeah.
Okay, so Shikha, when you said that you researched and you read up on the archives and the materials available, and you grasped what her voice was at the level of attributes, or these are the 510 attributes. Then when you wrote like her or when you spoke like her, were you incorporating those elements of voice at a very high level, at a very intuitive level, or was it more granular, like at the level of nitty-gritty, like the length of the sentences or a certain choice of vocabulary, etc.?
So I think it was a combination of things because, in the 19th century, they were much more formal in the way they spoke, dear sir. I mean, even though we do write dear sir, but I think we're much more casual in this generation. But there was a formal voice. There was a voice of respect. She was very respectful of everybody around her, but she had the strength. So the challenge was to sort of weave in her strength along with her politeness. And she was in many ways very traditional, but she was also in many ways very modern. So just keeping all of those things in mind and not trying to have my bias. But another thing which I did is that I weaved in a lot of her words wherever I could, her actual sentences, her things she had actually said, and that way I was actually bringing her voice into this. It wasn't my voice. So I tried to put whatever I could find through her letters, her thoughts. I mean, different nuances of things, the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she ate. I tried to integrate all of that into the poems as well. Yeah.
Shikha, was it ever a concern? Was accuracy ever a concern, given that your subject was historical?
To me, it was because, I felt a responsibility that if I'm going to tell someone else's story, I have to try and be as accurate about the facts as possible. So when I wrote the poems, I checked and I double checked. And then in the bibliography, where there's a notes section also, I actually reference which books I sourced these facts from in the poem, so that if a reader wanted to try and trace where did this come from, I actually have mentioned that. So I did try to stick to her story and her facts as much as possible. But of course, I did make some creative leaps, in terms of,
Yes.
how did she feel when she went to the Barnum and Bailey circus and saw, people from South Asia who were performing things for the pleasure of this audience of white people and things that might be considered degrading or demeaning. I couldn't find her response except to say she didn't like it. But then I imagined how she might not have liked it, right? So I did make some creative leaps for sure, but I tried to stay true to the facts of her life as well.
Shikha, did you have a lot of any precedents or a lot of precedents for such a project?
Like, what do you mean in terms of precedent?
I mean, like in terms of talking about a historical persona through persona poems, like poetry as alternative history.
Right. So actually, I had fallen in love with this way of looking at history by coming across some wonderful writers. One of them is Taimba Jess, who wrote this Pulitzer Prize winning, or is it National Book Award winning book called Olio, Olio. And in Olio, he had taken the history of Black musicians and Black performers, vaudeville performers, things like that, in the 19th and 20th century. And he gave voice to all of these people whose voices had not been recorded. This was before recording technology had come. So like he wrote in the voice of the first Black opera singer in America. He wrote in the voice of these sisters conjoined sisters. And what he did was he took these syncopated sonnets and he joined them in the middle to show these conjoined sisters. So, I had come across, collections like his. And there was another poet named Dominique Christina who wrote about the experiments that were done on Black women by the father of modern gynecology, Dr. Marion Sims. The instruments that are used today in gynecology that were invented by Dr. Sims came as a result of these horrific experiments that he did on Black women, which he had purchased as slaves and then done the experiments, right? And yes, he may have thought he was helping others, but these women went through a lot of pain in order for, what we have now as medical conveniences. So after reading, collections like that, I thought, what a unique and innovative way to look at history, to talk about history. It doesn't just have to be in the textbooks. There's so much that's, in alternative forms, that's in the margins that we can bring out. I mean, yes, there are nonfiction books that have been written about Anandibai Joshi, where she is a chapter, or where, she's novelized and fictionalized. But this is a way where we can put down facts, but they're bite-sized, they're in poetry form, much more accessible to people, I feel. Yeah.
Totally. Shikha, would you like to read us a poem, please?
Sure, I'd love to. In fact, the poem that I'd like to read is the poem which then I have a prompt on as well. So yeah, where is it? Hold on one second. I thought I'd marked it, but where is it? Here we go. Okay. Yeah. So this poem is based on the photograph I'd mentioned that set me out on this journey of the three women. And at that time, we have to remember that exoticism was at its all-time high here in the Western world. So when this picture was taken, they're three doctors, but they're all in their native costume. They're holding things or next to things that are considered exotic. And one of the first things I wondered was, why aren't they wearing like the doctor's coat? Why don't they have a stethoscope or anything else that signifies that these are three women that are doctors? So this poem is what you would call an ekphrastic poem based on a piece of art or a photograph, but also these women are talking back. And it is an epistolary, it's not an epistolary poem. It's also, a persona poem. It's in first person in Anandibai's voice. So when they ask us to pose for a photograph at the Women's Medical College reception, Philadelphia, 1885. Forgive us if we don't smile. The ocean's scent, still on our clothes, the stench of sea. We, visitors of another clime, of warmer lands are we. With pride we wear our native clothes, silks and jewels we proudly don, sari, kimono, headdress of coins, with lyre, sash, a handheld fan, no scalpel, stethoscope, or degree. 3 female doctors, a foreign pedigree, playing dress-up for Western eyes. In our appearance, they see worlds wild. Forgive us if we don't smile. Yeah.
Beautiful. And what's the prompt?
All right, I'll share that prompt with you. So choose a historical figure that you would find interesting, and it can be a positive or a negative, figure to you. It doesn't have to be, someone who did something, fantastic. It could be someone that you don't like at all, someone that you hate. Anyway, research this figure and try to find a photograph of them. Think about the time period they lived in. What did they wear and eat? How did they speak? What were the challenges, at that time? And then, keeping all of this in mind, imagine how this historical figure might speak. If they had to share one thing based on their life or in the photograph that you're viewing, what would that be? How would they do it? Write down what they might say in the form of a poetic letter, which could be an epistolary poem, or you can do a list of all the things that are in the photograph. So, something to just sort of get the creative juices flowing, and you'd be surprised at what comes up.
Wonderful. Yeah, I'm thinking of Hitler and this documentary that I was watching. It humanized him so much. And I was watching the documentary and I was like, whoa. I mean, everybody has a human side to it. You just need to look with the right mindset. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shikha and Hiba and Sascha, for your time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.